When we spoke last time about Subcarpathian Rus within the framework of Czechoslovakia, which of course, and now we're looking at a whole map of Czechoslovakia, and you know where it is in the east. We saw that the Czechoslovak government was reluctant, it was a procrastinator to fulfill its original promise of self-government or autonomy for this region of Subcarpathian Rus. But that question did not disappear from the political agenda of local activists throughout this entire interwar period. And in fact, the debate about autonomy only increased in intensity during the second half of the 1930s. The leading political party that had promoted this issue ever since the 1920s was something called the Agricultural Cultural Union by a man named Andriy Brodiy, and then something called the Russian National Party by a man named Stepan Fentsyk. And I'm going to put up here Russophiles because for all intents and purposes, that's more or less what they were. We'll see the implication of that in a moment. Now, aside from cooperating with all Czechoslovak parties throughout the entire country, that included the Sudeten German party, we'll touch on that in a moment, but parties that were in opposition to the government, these pro-autonomy activists in Subcarpathian Rus, in particular Brodiy and Fentsyk, also accepted funds from Czechoslovakia's enemies, whether from Hungary, or in the case of Brodiy from Hungary, in the case of Fentsyk from Poland. And then we have something called the Central Rusyn National Council. This was the body that in May 1919 in Uzhorod proclaimed the voluntary union of Carpatho-Rusyns with Czechoslovakia and adopted a common position on this autonomy question. In 1936, this council submitted a constitutional proposal for an autonomous Subcarpathian Rus. There have been numerous, throughout the interwar period, proposals given to the Czechoslovak government to implement autonomy, and very specific legal proposals. Clearly, by 1936, the Czechoslovak government felt that they had to give some kind of response. They had to deal with this somehow. But the response that they gave was far from what local Carpatho-Rusyn leaders expected. Instead of implementing autonomy, the Czechoslovak government adopted a law in June 1937. June 1937. And this law in June 1937 was clearly not what Carpatho-Rusyns expected. It really only slightly altered the functions of Subcarpathia's governor. He was now made the formal head of the fourth province of Subcarpathian Rus. He was allowed to recommend laws for the region. But in reality, it was the vice governor of the province, always a Czech, not its governor, always a Carpatho-Rusyn, who remained the most powerful political figure in the region. So clearly there was no autonomy. This ongoing procrastination on the part of the Czechoslovak government regarding the autonomy question now resulted in the following scenario. On the one hand, virtually all of Subcarpathia's political leaders, whether they represented pro-government parties or whether they represented parties in opposition to the government, all of them were alienated by the Central Czechoslovak government. On the other hand, Subcarpathia's rival Russophile and Ukrainophile politicians, that is, those who felt that they were Russian as opposed to those who felt that they were Ukrainian, and all of the factions within them, they actually joined in solidarity with the governor of Subcarpathian Rus, at this time a man named Hrabar, all of them to demand that the Czechoslovak government act seriously on this autonomy question. In the spring of 1938, the leading Russophile politicians and the Ukrainophile politicians, and on that side of the equation, I'll just mention two people of importance, Avhustyn, Voloshyn, Iulian, Revai. So many of these are internally opposed on various issues, but on the autonomy issue, they're all in sync, if you will. They put aside their differences on the nationality question and made possible the adoption of a resolution 1 year later in May 1938 by what is now called the First Russian-Ukrainian Central National Council. So they're all working together, calling on the Czechoslovak government, one, to introduce in the shortest possible time elections to a Subcarpathian autonomous diet, and two, quote, to unite with Subcarpathian Rus those territories in eastern Slovakia inhabited by Carpatho-Rusyns. So these two demands, autonomy and the border or unification, same, are now still on the agenda. But by 1938, Czechoslovakia had much more serious problems. Much more serious problems than political discontent in its far eastern province of Subcarpathian Rus. In fact, before the end of that year, Czechoslovakia's very existence was to be called into question. Well, how did that come about? Ever since the close of World War I in late 1918, the defeated states which managed to survive the conflict were deeply dissatisfied with the political order that was created at the Paris Peace Conference by the victors in 1919, 1920, and 1921. Already in the 1920s, Hungary was calling for border revisions. Now in the 1930s, Hungary was joined by what turned out to be an even greater threat to the post-war European order set up at the Paris Peace Conference, and that threat was Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Now, caught in the middle of these irredentist powers, Germany on the one hand, Hungary on the other, is what? Czechoslovakia, right smack in the middle. Hitler was determined to correct what he and most of the German public, on this, they backed him, who felt that these injustices of the Paris Peace Conference that were imposed on them, specifically that Treaty of Versailles, which was the one that dealt specifically with Germany. By the second half of the 1930s, Nazi Germany embarked on a policy that was intended to unite all Germans living beyond the borders of Germany, the so-called Volksdeutsche, into what was now being called the Third German Reich. One should know in the case of German political rhetoric, there are Volksdeutsche and Reichsdeutsche. Reichsdeutsche are Germans who live within the German state. Volksdeutsche are those who live outside a German state. Well, why should there even be Volksdeutsche living outside a German state? Well, that is part of European history going back to the Middle Ages, when already in the 12th and 13th century, the kings primarily of Hungary and of Poland, these big kingdoms, later Tsarist Russia, invited Germans to come and settle in their territories and gave them all kinds of privileges. And they still live there well into the 20th century. Some of them still live in some of these places today, despite World War II, but that changed a lot. But the point is that here you had all of these ethnic Germans, functioning as Germans, speaking German, etc., throughout Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And those were the Volksdeutsche. They were Germans, but they didn't live in a German state. And so now Hitler makes this the major policy of his regime, to protect these Volksdeutsche living outside a German state. His first step was directed toward Austria, by the way of which he's a native. Austria, Germanic people, of course subject to the Habsburg Empire, but Germans in Austria. Actually, Austria wanted to join Germany after the war, but the victorious Allied powers said, no. This is an example of a state coming into being against its will. That's how Austria came into being in 1918. 2 decades later now, in March 1938, Hitler simply concluded an annexation pact, Anschluss as it was known, with Austria, making that country a part of the Third Reich. By the way, not everyone in Austria agreed to this. In particular, those who were of the upper noble class going back to Habsburg era. Who's the most famous example of those who disagreed with the Nazi Anschluss or taking over Austria? It's based on a film which you should have even heard about, I think, which was a Broadway musical called The Sound of Music. Has anyone here in your age actually seen The Sound of Music? Well, that's what that story is all about. It's a story about the family headed by an Austrian aristocrat who detests these Nazis and doesn't want Austria to become part of Germany. Well, that's what's happening here, literally at this time in March 1938. But the Anschluss is completed, and Austria now is part of Nazi-led German Third Reich. Now we have Austria secured. Hitler could devote full attention to his next victim, Czechoslovakia. And after a series now of propaganda speeches and how terrible Czechoslovakia is, and remember, from the Hitlerian perspective, Czechoslovakia is like a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany. Poor Germany. Now, Hitler's demands on Czechoslovakia were initially limited only to the ethnic German inhabited areas of Bohemia and Moravia. That is where Volksdeutsche lived. And that was an area all around the edges of Bohemia, Silesia, and Moravia. So all of the edge here. And that area was popularly known as the Sudetenland. So in the it was a popular term, Sudetenland. When I first came here, can you imagine when I first came here to Toronto in 1980, right over here on Spadina, just north of College, there was a Sudeten German bookstore. That is a German bookstore that just specialized in books about the Sudetenland. This idea of the Sudetenland, and many of these things being really German and still should be, had not yet gone away. In late September 1938, Hitler, how is he going to achieve this? Hitler's a peaceful person. So what does he do? He invites to the city of Munich, which is the main city in the German land of Bavaria, his political ally Benito Mussolini of Italy. And he also invites the prime ministers of Great Britain, Neville, Chamberlain, France, Daladier, to discuss what he described, quote unquote, as the Czechoslovak crisis. Now, Great Britain and France were allies of Czechoslovakia going back to the allies of World War I. They're the ones that favored the creation of Czechoslovakia. And ostensibly, they were expected to come to the aid of that small Central European country should it be threatened by its neighbors. But instead, the British and French leaders agreed, with fascist Italy's blessings, that on ethnic grounds, Germany had the right to annex the Sudetenland. That is, those portions of Western Czechoslovakia that were inhabited by ethnic Germans. And therefore, what became known as the Munich Pact of September 1938, the Munich Pact, Hitler's demands were, quote unquote, appeased. And large parts of Bohemia and Moravia were simply annexed to Nazi Germany. Now, this Munich Pact also stipulated that Czechoslovakia, what was left of it, must change its internal structure. And as a result, the other two provinces of the country, Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus, and by the way, when we look at this, here is Sudetenland, you see? The white, that's the Sudetenland, where Czechs didn't reside. But now they have to address these other parts of the country. And as a result, these two provinces were now granted the autonomy that the leaders of both regions, Slovaks for Slovakia and Carpatho-Rusyns for Subcarpathian Rus that they had been demanding throughout this entire interwar period. And so on October 11th, 1938, the cabinet of the first Subcarpathian autonomous government was appointed by the Czechoslovak government in Prague. So finally, autonomy is being implemented. This first government was dominated by the local Russophile orientation, and so the first premier of the cabinet was this man, Andriy Brodiy. But his government really only lasted for 15 days. But during that time, the interwar Czechoslovak regime was criticized by the cabinet for its so-called pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian education and cultural policy. And one of the things that it did during those short 2 weeks was to start closing all of the Czech language schools in Subcarpathian Rus. Propaganda efforts were made in eastern Slovakia, not surprisingly, to unite the Prešov region with the rest of Subcarpathian Rus. But the primary goal of this administration was to introduce a plebiscite so that the local population could decide their political future. Now, since the 1930s, this Brodiy was being subsidized by the Hungarian government. He was convinced that this was a trouble-free way to achieve the irredentist, revisionist demands of Hungary. But these intrigues were exposed. He was forced to resign. He was actually arrested by the Czechoslovak authorities. And on October 26, 2 weeks later, Prague appointed a new government, autonomous government, this time headed by the Ukrainophiles under the man named Augustin Voloshyn. And with that appointment, the domination of the Ukrainian orientation in the region's political life began. Now, this Munich Pact, as I said, represented only the first phase in resolving what Nazi Germany referred to as this Czechoslovak crisis, or this Czechoslovak problem. Germany's most recent ally, now Hungary gets on board here. Germany looks good. It's being successful. Let's get on their side. And Hungary allies with Nazi Germany and is now a beneficiary of the next phase of the kind of Munich solution. Less than 6 weeks after Munich, another conference was held, this time in Vienna, which by then, capital of Austria, now part of Nazi Germany. And there on November 2nd, 1938, an agreement was reached regarding the further dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. And so what happened? We have something called the Vienna Award. According to the Vienna Award, now territory was detached from the country's eastern provinces, that is Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus. So first we have the Sudetenland, which went to Nazi Germany, where ethnic Germans lived, these Volksdeutsche. Now we have the southern regions of Slovakia, all of this white, and of Subcarpathian Rus, where ethnic Hungarians lived. As a result of this, what remains of Subcarpathian Rus, they lose the main cities of Uzhorod, they lose the main cities of Mukachevo, and they are forced to move their capital to the eastern town of Khust. And I believe that Khust was on your map exam. So they lose Uzhorod, they lose Mukachevo, and now Khust becomes the center and the capital of autonomous Subcarpathian Rus. But despite that, the Hungarians are still displeased because they expected to get the entire region, at the very least, if not the rest of Slovakia as well. And local support for such a goal now came from this Bordii and Fentsyk, those leading figures in the first autonomous government. They now find their way to Uzhorod in the Hungarian zone, and they immediately embark on a propaganda campaign to help the Hungarians, or Hungary, obtain the rest of Subcarpathian Rus. The Greek Catholic bishop residing in Uzhorod, now in the Hungarian zone, and other ranking members of the Greek Catholic Church, they soon come out in support of the return of their homeland to Hungary. And the result of that was that any pro-Czechoslovak people from the Rusinophile orientation, or even from there were some pro-Czechoslovak Russophiles as well, but the Rusinophile organization and them lost their organizational leadership, the Greek Catholic leadership, so that effectively that meant that what remained as autonomous Subcarpathian Rus was now in the hands of the Ukrainophiles. Now, despite this new border, which was recreated by the November 2nd agreement in Vienna, and this is what we are looking at now. This was that new border. Within a few weeks, paramilitary and other underground armed units from Hungary undertook terrorist raids into Subcarpathian Rus. And these incursions were not only coming from the south, from Hungary, but also from Poland. And unofficially, the Polish government is sending in raiders from the north. Why Poland and Hungary are doing this simultaneously against this part of Czechoslovakia? Well, the government of Poland traditionally was sympathetic to Hungary's long-term policy against Czechoslovakia, and so it authorized its forces to undertake raids from the north. To protect itself from these incursions, this government, under Augustin Voloshyn, authorized in early November 1938 the creation of something called the Carpathian Siege Organization. The Carpathian Siege Organization. And what was this? Well, for all intents and purposes, it was a military force for national defense. Most of its members, there were about 2,000 of them. By the way, only about 300 or 400 were armed. But most of them were actually not from the local region itself, but were Ukrainians who began to arrive from neighboring Polish-controlled Galicia in the north. Why would Ukrainians be coming there? They were members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that underground movement that was fighting Polish rule in their homeland of Eastern Poland or Galicia, had been doing so since the 1930s. This guerrilla war continues to go on. At the same time, they set up their own cells in various neighboring countries where, from their perspective, Ukrainians lived, and that included in Subcarpathian Rus. And these volunteers from Galicia, they saw what they now called Carpatho-Ukraine as a modern-day Ukrainian Piedmont. In other words, Carpatho-Ukraine was viewed as the basis from which, in the future, an independent, greater Ukrainian state would be formed when Poland and the Soviet Union would be transformed or preferably collapse. Now, this seems a little bit unrealistic, a little bit silly, a little bit pie in the sky. this tiny little territory is going to be a basis for an independent Ukrainian state on territories that are ruled by Poland and by the Soviet Union. However, those ideas were actually supported by Nazi Germany. It had initiated the transformation of Czechoslovakia. It had encouraged the creation of an autonomous Subcarpathian Rus, as well as Slovakia. And in particular, members of Voloshyn's cabinet consulted with Nazi Germany directly of its government in Berlin, and also with a German consulate. A German consulate, Nazi German consulate, was set up in this capital of Khust, giving economic support from Germany to this area. So it wasn't pie in the sky. And certainly for a few months, Subcarpathian Rus had come to the attention of the international community and was part of Germany's plans for the political transformation of Central and Eastern Europe as a whole. Now, in legal terms, this autonomous Subcarpathian Rus was formally called into being by a constitutional amendment adopted by the Czechoslovak parliament on November 22nd, 1938. This was still part of Czechoslovakia. Autonomy is not independence, remember. Autonomy is just self-rule within another political entity. Now, the Ukrainophiles, of course, being a little bit of aggressive here, they wanted to even change the name of this province to Carpatho-Ukraine. But the official designation remained Subcarpathian Rus, with a proviso that the alternative name Carpatho-Ukraine could also be used. Czechoslovakia's constitutional amendment also included a provision which called for elections to a diet, which was the other demand all along by Subcarpathian politicians, called for an election to the diet within 5 months. This future diet was to be responsible for passing laws to govern the province and for deciding the question of its official name and its language. So, full autonomy. Now, while the future diet was to be given final say regarding this controversial issue of the language to be taught in schools, it was soon clear that in education and in cultural matters, this administration under Avhustyn Voloshyn adopted distinctly Ukrainian characteristics. The various gymnasia, these senior high schools, professional schools, teachers' college, that were located in what now became part of Hungary, they all moved to the north into Subcarpathian Rus, Carpatho-Ukraine. All of the teachers, directors, and inspectors were required to use the Ukrainian language. Those Czech schools that had existed from the interwar period continued to be closed. Large number of Czech administrators and teachers who served the province during those 2 interwar decades, they now began to leave and go back to where they had come from, the western portions of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and Moravia. Now, despite the domination of this Ukrainian orientation under Voloshyn, the Russophiles, there were those people who felt that they were Russian, they were still around, and they were active. Brodiy and Fentsyk were compromised, but there were others that were pro-Czechoslovak, supported the idea of remaining within a federated Czechoslovakia. And they created a council in this Khust in support of their ideas. Now, they may have been discontent with the Ukrainophile policies of the Voloshyn regime, but so too another source of discontent was the Orthodox population, organized at the time in about 140 parishes. They had been indoctrinated with a love of all things Russian, and so most Orthodox rejected the Ukrainian ideology of this regime under Voloshyn. Voloshyn himself and his cabinet were plagued by increased difficulties with the central government in Prague. There were two issues of concern. Central government in Prague was still making appointees to the autonomous government. They appointed a Czech general from the area. The Ukrainophiles didn't like this. Also, this problem of all of these former Czech officials being fired from their jobs, that was a source of friction. And also, Voloshyn had difficulties with the new autonomous government in neighboring Slovakia, because pro-Ukrainian elements continued to demand the union of Carpatho-Rusyns in the Prešov region with Subcarpathian Rus. Notwithstanding these internal and external, rather enormous difficulties that it faced, the pro-Ukrainian administration in Khust did in fact prepare for those elections that were promised, elections to an autonomous diet. And the announcement came on January 12th, 1939. Elections were to occur 1 month later. And they did. In an attempt to clarify the internal political situation as they were preparing for these elections, all existing political parties from the Czechoslovakia era, in which they were all political parties, they were now declared invalid. And new parties were called on to submit candidates, but they only allowed two parties. That is the Ukrainian National Union and also a German party. The Ukrainian National Union, really the only party, presented a list of 32 candidates, many of whom were prominent local members in interwar parties, but now who were united under the idea of Ukrainian nationalism. And so elections did take place. Not surprisingly, February 12, 1939 turned out to be overwhelmingly positive for the Ukrainian ticket. I mean, that was the only ticket you could really vote for, or you could just protest and not vote at all. In the end, 92% of the voters cast their vote and accepted this list of Ukrainian candidates. And on March 2nd, the Diet of Carpatho-Ukraine actually held its inaugural session. So all of these promises, in one way or another, with their foibles, were carried out. Despite the electoral success, and I'm coming to a close, that was registered by this government led by Voloshyn, it was to be allotted little more than 4 weeks of existence. Why? Well, by February 1939, it had become evident to many political observers in Western Europe that Hitler was only waiting for the right moment to dismantle the remainder of Czechoslovakia and to give Hungary the signal to occupy the rest of Subcarpathian Rus. All along the Hungarian and Polish borders, those terrorists increased their attacks. Internally, the remaining weeks of the Voloshyn regime were marked by increased friction with the central government in Prague and even with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that didn't like his policies. But it was really events elsewhere that were to seal the fate of Carpatho-Ukraine. By early March, Hitler simply decided to liquidate what remained of Czechoslovakia. On March 13th, the infamous Ides of March, the premier of autonomous Slovakia, neighboring Slovakia, was summoned to Berlin. He was urged to declare Slovakia an independent state under German protection. If not, Hitler would give the green light to Hungary. Not much of a choice. The following day, March 14th, the Slovak Autonomous Diet proclaimed its independence. So now, faced with Slovakia's act of independence, Voloshyn also declared Carpatho-Ukraine's independence in the early evening of March 14th. But his request that independent Carpatho-Ukraine become a protectorate, like Slovakia, of Nazi Germany, that request was rejected. And instead, on March 15th, 1939, as German troops entered Prague, the capital of what remained of Czechoslovakia, and then fully annexed Bohemia and Moravia to the Third Reich, the same day Berlin gave its approval to Hungary to enter Carpatho-Ukraine. No less than 50,000 Hungarian troops moved in three groups, two from Uzhorod and Mukachevo northward toward the crest of the Carpathians, a third up the Tisa Valley. And on the afternoon of March 15th, as those Hungarian troops were approaching Carpatho-Ukraine's capital, Khust, Voloshyn convened the Diet. The 22 deputies who were present hastily approved a symbolic act which called into being the independent state of Carpatho-Ukraine, and they elected as its president this Avhustyn Voloshyn. But there was no support from Nazi Germany, and faced with an ultimatum from the advancing Hungarian army, now President Voloshyn, his cabinet, and the Diet's deputies left the country. As for that Carpathian Sich military force, it was joined by a few dozen enthusiastic but inexperienced gymnasium students who did try to resist the Hungarian invasion. They were overwhelmed, not without the loss of several lives, the first lives lost in World War II, in a sense, by these advancing Hungarians. By March 16th, the Hungarian army had control of Khust, and within 2 more days it occupied all of Subcarpathian Rus. Such was the end of autonomous Carpatho-Ukraine and its republic for a day.